Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to IGE Forum. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome the K-Policy platform members who will be joining us for this forum. Today, we are most fortunate to have a distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Schott, world's leading expert on international trade policy. He will be joining us live from Florida, actually, his second home in Florida, rather than cold Washington, D.C., to discuss the very timely issues of new trade policy goals in the Biden administration, especially in the context of the challenge China poses for trade and investment and regional stability. We will also discuss the implications of changing U.S. policies for key allies, particularly Korea. Mr. Schott is currently a senior fellow of working on international trade policy and economic sanctions at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He has taught at Princeton University as well as Georgetown University, and has served as an official of the U.S. Treasury Department in international trade and energy policy. Since 2003, Jeff has been a member of the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy. He holds a graduate degree with distinction from Johns Hopkins University. Without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Jeffrey Schott, who will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by Q&As until 10 a.m. as scheduled, or 11 a.m. I should say, or even longer. Is very generous to stay with us if there are more questions. Okay, hi, Jeff. Thank you very much for joining us this morning over there, or evening. I'm so very delighted to see you again, even though virtually this time around.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be back with you and your colleagues and participate again in an IGE forum and to see, at least virtually, several old friends. And it's always been a great pleasure for me to join you. I prefer to do it in Seoul, in person. But we have to make sacrifices in these difficult times, and hopefully next year I'll be able to see you again in person. I'm also pleased that we have the participation of members of the K-Policy platform, and I look forward to our discussion. Let me start by saying that we've just had 4 tumultuous years of the Trump administration, during which U.S. policy challenged friend and foe alike. And I thought it would be useful to note in my discussion today what will change in terms of U.S. policy and its implementation, and what will stay the same. Because even though there's a great difference between former President Trump and President Biden, in the area of trade policy, they have many of the same constituents, particularly in the labor unions. So the first order, I think, is to note that President Biden will likely retain much of Trump's trade policy legacy. The confrontation with China on trade and investment, including the trade war tariffs, is likely to continue. And high-tech export controls and screening of Chinese investments in the United States is likely to continue. Both of these have implications because of the knock-on effects for Korean business that have interests in both the Chinese and the U.S. markets. U.S. import barriers on steel and aluminum introduced under Section 232 national security controls are likely, at least in the short run, to continue. because it's difficult politically to remove them without some other changes. Restrictive Buy American procurement policies are likely to be maintained, and they will become actually quite significant in impact because of the planned increases in infrastructure investment by the federal and state governments. U.S. is likely to stay on the sideline on the CPTPP in the short run, but I suspect, as I will note later in the talk, that there may be a change in this policy, U.S. policy, sooner rather than later because of action forcing events in Asia. And finally, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, is likely to serve as a template for future U.S. trade pacts and future revisions of existing free trade agreements. While we have had several iterations of the Chorus FTA, it is not out of the question that there could be more, and I'll talk about that a little later as well. But the content and the implementation of U.S. trade policies will differ in key respects. And most importantly, I think America will resume its global leadership instead of an America First policy that has too often been viewed as my way or the highway. And I think this will require, and it will, and the Biden administration will seek extensive consultations with our key allies. This will be a big difference from the Trump era, when we acted first and then consulted, if at all, later. In addition, there will be a recommitment to the World Trade Organization and multilateralism, even though the prospects for groundbreaking advances in WTO reforms will be difficult, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. Perhaps the most stark difference with the Trump era will be the emphasis on trade and climate, with the focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and supporting international initiatives to that end. It already started with the U.S. Readmission to the Paris Accord, and the United States has, and President Biden has put together a top-level team inside the White House to deal both with the international negotiations on climate matters, led by former Secretary of State John Kerry, and also the domestic policy reforms that are necessary to look forward to a greener economy in the future. And that is being coordinated by a number of experienced hands from the Obama administration, including former EPA Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Gina McCarthy. The other area of significant difference with Trump will be greater priority to counter human rights abuses and anti-democracy practices via economic sanctions and other measures. This will only deepen the frictions that the U.S. has with China, and it will be an area which has to be carefully managed so that it doesn't cause very deep disruptions in international trade and investment. I don't foresee near-term new trade negotiations. I think the first-year focus will be on the domestic agenda and self-strengthening of American industry, getting our house back in order, recovering from the economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The other thing that will remain the same is relations with China will continue to dominate U.S. trade policy. The main goals will be different. In the Trump era, it seemed like U.S. officials were intent to raise tariffs on Chinese goods just as an end in themselves, to blunt export of U.S. technology to Chinese firms and commit to purchase and commit China to purchase more U.S. farm and industrial goods and services. we're left with the residue of that policy, most of which has failed. Penalty tariffs remain on about 2/3 of bilateral trade, and it will be difficult politically to reduce those tariffs in the near term. And that has led to a reduction in two-way trade between the United States and China. The purchase commitments, which President Trump put at the forefront of his trade negotiations with China, were also underwhelming. China did not buy much U.S. goods or U.S. goodwill under the bilateral trade deal. The targets for the purchase commitments were set in value terms and subsequently inflated by President Trump because he thought the numbers were too small. He wanted big numbers. And so it was basically trumped up to levels that were inconsistent with what was feasible in the marketplace. In that sense, the Phase 1 deal was almost set up to fail, and it has failed in reaching its purchase commitments. To give you an idea, the commitments that were supposed to add an additional $200 billion in Chinese imports from the United States over a 2-year period. Additional 75 billion in 2020 and an additional 125 billion in 2021 above the baseline, but the baseline was set in 2017. The trade in 2019 was actually lower than the baseline. And so the increased trade that was required to occur in 2020 and subsequently in 2021 was even greater. In the event, the Chinese, because of the unrealistic nature of the deal and the decreased demand because of the pandemic and the African swine flu fever, which it devastated the swine herds in China, has led to an under purchases or purchases under target rather in agriculture, energy, and manufacturers, significantly under. And while the target for those sets of goods was supposed to be $143 billion in 2020, the actual trade came in about 94 billion. So only about 60% of target, well under, and the odds of China getting even that close to the targets for 2021 are even less because the targets are so much higher. This has affected a number of important products, and the trade in autos, trucks, and parts, where China was supposed to buy a substantial amount from the United States, was actually well under. And I think that was due to the new Chinese tariffs, retaliatory tariffs that were imposed in mirror image to the US tariffs on Chinese goods, and preferences for foreign direct investment in the Chinese market in the auto sector that benefited BMW and other producers. Interestingly, there was an increase above target in the purchase of semiconductors from the United States. But that, I think, can be almost fully explained by the intention to pre-build inventories in China in anticipation of new stringent US export controls. And we're likely to see a sharp drop in semiconductor sales to China going forward. Now, Biden's strategy towards China will involve a mix of cooperation, competition, and opposition. unlike Trump's mercantilist trade deal, Biden's China strategy will be more comprehensive, strategic, and pragmatic, integrating commercial and foreign policy objectives. Now, of course, that makes it very difficult and sensitive to determine trade-offs between commercial and foreign policy goals. And so the Biden administration will have to walk very carefully on a very icy surface in trying to navigate moving forward with this trilateral agenda. The relations will be classified in three large buckets. I think there will be a focus on areas of cooperation with each other and with third countries. And here there will be a focus on working together to combat the pandemic, working together to deal with climate change. There will be another bucket where areas where commercial relations will be marked by sharp competition. And this more broadly will be the area of trade and investment. There will be sharp competition. There will be some controls for national security reasons. I'll get to that in a moment. But the idea will be not to decouple to the extent possible, but to compete and compete more aggressively. And that will involve subsidies. It will involve government support of other kinds for US industry going head to head with Chinese competitors. Of course, they will also be going head to head with Korean competitors. And so that's something that will involve important discussions between our two governments. Areas of fundamental differences will be addressed by the United States, unlike the more muted response of the Trump administration. And these fundamental differences are where policies will be adversarial with regard to human rights, for example. But there will need to be a recognition that these fundamental differences need to be carefully managed to avoid broader confrontation. Now, in the area of cooperation, the United States will seek to revitalize the strategic dialogue with China. Consultations are needed to prevent the escalation of bilateral disputes involving trade, investment, and visa restrictions, as I noted. Importantly, there needs to be care taken in the enforcement of US economic sanctions, which have become more targeted for particular Chinese policies, including developments in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. There needs to be care, particularly in the administration of the new Hong Kong Autonomy Act, that the United States does not impose new or takes care in it with regard to sanctions on major financial institutions that do business with both countries, and where sanctions could be very disruptive to regional trade and investment. The Chinese, in turn, have imposed their own blocking statutes, very similar to what the Europeans and the British have done in the past. And that puts companies, both US and Korean and other companies, in a very difficult position between a rock and a hard place. If they obey US sanctions, they violate Chinese blocking statutes and are vulnerable to retribution from Chinese authorities. If they follow Chinese law, they are liable to US sanctions and great penalties, possibly under US law. So there needs to be some better guidance on how to navigate this very narrow strait to enable businesses to better plan their trade and investment strategies. The consultations will also need to deal with commercial cybersecurity. And this is a problem that has been growing in leaps and bounds and was very notable in the recent past, not only with regard to China, but with regard to Russia and other countries. There needs to be an agreement between the United States and China and other important countries that we need to have constraints on commercial cybersecurity for fear that if we don't constrain it, it will lead to more and more aggressive retaliation and then great damage to our economies and our international relations. Now, cooperation is needed where, as my friend Bob Zellick calls it, the United States and China are responsible stakeholders in the global economy. And here it's mitigating global warming, it's responding to current and future pandemics, and it's deterring the proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran and North Korea. Now, U.S.-China cooperation is also essential to achieve international consensus on global trade reforms. An area that I know my friend Bark Tae-ho is spent so many years working to strengthen the international trading system, and I'm very pleased to see that he's with us today. But without US-China cooperation, it is much harder to achieve international consensus on needed global trade reforms, and that's going to be a big challenge. We need to update WTO rules and procedures, including dispute settlement. We need to develop rules to govern global access to vaccines and to deter vaccine nationalism. This has been a growing problem just in the recent months as vaccines have been approved on an emergency basis for distribution. And we have seen countries trying to buy up supplies of available vaccine, and developing countries are in a difficult situation. And if we don't have universal application of the vaccines, the problems in South Africa and Brazil and elsewhere are going to come and infect the countries that have been vaccinated because of the development of variants of the virus. We already see that happening. It's essential that we have universal vaccination and that the countries that have been developing the vaccines make them available to rich and poor alike. Cooperation is also needed in developing rules for digital trade. Progress has been made by the United States in the USMCA and elsewhere, but it's a very difficult situation because there are differences even among the Western democracies on how you deal with access to data and privacy concerns. And but this is an area where, given the substantial position of China in digital trade, I think it has to be brought into the equation as much as it can, given its very restrictive data policies. We'll need to formulate, again, as I said, pro-climate trade disciplines. China has got to be a part of that policy. I think bringing together the large economies of the Asia-Pacific basin, I think we could find a solution because Korea and Japan and the United States and China all share, all recognize the need to do more, and I think we can do more. Where the greatest difficulty will be in the WTO reforms is in updating the subsidy rules, including support for how do you discipline support for state-owned enterprises. That's critical for having a level playing field in an arena that includes China, and there will need to be new ideas and new ways of thinking about developing new subsidy rules, perhaps starting on a sector-specific basis, or even involving subsectors to address subsidies that go directly to steel firms or civil aviation, for example. Now, commercial competition will become more intense and spur partial decoupling of the US and China economies. That is going to happen, and the challenge will be to limit the damage because the more the two major economies decouple, the more there's collateral damage for their trading partners. The US is likely to uphold the phase one deal. That's unfortunate because we want to see an unraveling of the tariffs. That's going to take some time. More importantly is what the United States does on export controls. I think under existing US law, those controls on high-tech trade and the screening of inward direct and portfolio investment will be recalibrated. And I think there will be a greater focus on critical technologies. So the idea would be you impose export controls on a narrower range of activities or technologies, but in those that are deemed critical, you put a high fence of protection around it. Instead of the policy that we currently have now, somewhat ambiguous, that projects export controls on a wide range of high technology activities. The Biden administration is starting a 100-day review to analyze supply chains in particular sectors, including semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, critical minerals, and medical supplies. Just by those four areas, you can see that they are trying to focus more narrowly the scope of US export, high-tech export controls and technology controls to limit the disruptions to normal commercial activity. Again, there's a growing risk that US financial sanctions will cause a disruption, as I mentioned before. And that's something that is only going to intensify because of the political demands to respond to the abuses that we've seen in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. In turn, China will continue its tit-for-tat retaliatory tariffs and economic sanctions under its new blocking law. But I suspect that if there is a way to de-escalate tensions, China will find a way to do so in kind. The third bucket, though, is the one that's the most intractable. And Presidents Biden and Xi will sharply disagree on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. President Biden, I'm sure, though I haven't been party to the 2-hour conversation he had with Xi Jinping a few days ago, will object to Chinese policies against the Uyghur minority, against the pro-democracy supporters in Hong Kong, and the Chinese military threats against Taiwan. And he will be under pressure to respond with countermeasures, including economic sanctions. And there are a number of bills that have been put forward in the Congress that would require the executive to act and impose sanctions against people and entities that do business with those responsible for those policies in China. China regards these policies as internal affairs, and the US opposition as an intrusion on Chinese sovereignty. And so, unless managed carefully, as I mentioned before, this could get to be a very fractious area of bilateral relations. And it's important to manage these intractable differences and avoid a broader decoupling of the two economies. Now, in my last few minutes, let me just try to say something that may be a little more uplifting, because so far it's not been the cheeriest discussion for early in the morning in Seoul. I think tensions with China may lead President Biden to renegotiate US participation in an Asian-Pacific trade pact. The original TPP was never politically popular, so Biden was reluctant to rejoin the existing pact, and he remains so. But why should the U.S. reconsider? I think there will be action-forcing events, but there's already a good case for the U.S. to revisit participation in an Asia-Pacific pact. The CPTPP that replaced the TPP already removed provisions that were objectionable to Democrats in Congress and led President Obama to avoid presenting the agreement for ratification in the Congress back in 2016. But subsequently, the U.S. adopted many of the TPP provisions in the revisions of the NAFTA called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. So we have already adopted many of the rules that are in the CPTPP. And of course, the CPTPP and the TPP before it was based on U.S. law and practice and drew heavily from the Chorus FTA, which means that Korea is in the same position, that it isn't a heavy lift to undertake the rulemaking in the CPTPP because of the comparability of those rules with those that Korea has already adopted in the Chorus FTA. But there's other reasons why the U.S. needs to reconsider. Deepening, and part of it is what China has been doing in advancing its leadership in the region, deepening ties through the RCEP and through ongoing negotiations for a China-Japan-Korea free trade agreement, and upgrading its existing free trade agreements with other countries. This will set regional rules and discriminate against U.S. trade and investment interests. And it's one of the reasons why we went into the TPP in the first place. But it is now even more important given the advances that China has made in the last couple of years. Chinese pressure against Taiwan is also increasing demands in Congress to deepen support for Taiwan via a new trade agreement. Negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with Taiwan, which some members of Congress are calling for, could cause a massive rupture in U.S.-China relations that I think would be damaging to everyone in the Asia-Pacific region. But perhaps Taiwan joining the CPTPP in partnership with the United States and hopefully Korea as well would provide a compromise solution, much like the solutions that were made to get that allowed Taiwan to join the WTO 20 years ago. There are a number of countries that are interested in joining the CPTPP. The United States should be there to make sure that the rules are set and set appropriately and to maintain high standards. And doing so would broaden support for trading rules in the CPTPP as revised and augmented that could provide precedents for broader multilateral reform in the WTO. In conclusion, I think that like the USMCA, U.S. officials are likely to join or rejoin an Asia-Pacific pact only if the deal is renegotiated. But I don't think the deal requires expansive renegotiation. And indeed, one only has to look at the USMCA for possible areas where the U.S. may seek to update the deal. The most difficult would be in extensive labor obligations and enforcement procedures, which will require some work to convince developing countries like Vietnam and Malaysia to go along and improve their pace of labor market reforms. But in other areas, I think the changes will be more incremental. Broader coverage of multilateral environmental agreements and fishery subsidies, marine conservation, wildlife trafficking rules. Those are areas where the TPP chapter was already quite good. USMCA goes a little better. Same thing on digital trade and the currency chapter in the USMCA, which mostly involves transparency obligations. I think the newest innovation, and one that would be very high on the Biden administration's priority list for rejoining or renegotiating the TPP, would be to add a new chapter on trade-related climate policies. And as I noted before, I think that's pushing on an open door with our trading partners in the Asia-Pacific region. So that and adding the commitments to better access to medicines, therapeutics, and medical equipment, which I think is already beginning to happen as a result of our pandemic response, would open the door to new negotiations and allow the United States to come back to the club. The final word is on what, and an optimistic note, is the U.S. will re-engage and lead efforts on WTO reform. But unfortunately, I had to put this at the end of the talk because it is not the highest priority for the Biden administration, because of skepticism that the WTO process itself will allow effective and efficient negotiation of needed trade reforms and rulemaking reforms at the multilateral level. The opposition of China and India and their insistence on special and differential treatment will slow the process down, as it has in the negotiations on fishery subsidies. And other developing countries may drag their feet or seek differential treatment when there is a need for a common obligations, even if there is asymmetric implementation of those obligations. But Biden has already started. He's broken the impasse on WTO leadership and supported Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the new WTO Director General. She's now in place, and she's a very competent and will be a very important leader of the WTO. I think one has to take a bow to Minister Yu, who was so gracious in putting the interests of the trading system above her personal aspirations. She was a highly qualified candidate and would have served with distinction as leader of the WTO, and maybe she will get another chance in the future. But her gracious action in stepping aside to allow the consensus on a new leader, I think was very notable and does her and the government of Korea great credit. The next step, though, in Geneva will be to formulate a compromise to deal with the disabled appellate body. And I think there, if countries are willing to compromise, there are already good proposals on the table for dealing with that problem. The WTO needs quick wins. And I think the best prospects are new pacts targeting access to medicines and vaccines, and an improved, augmented environmental goods agreement. That and a new agenda on trade and environment, I think will be a great priority, and one where the United States will put a lot of effort. And that would be an important area where the WTO can make important new contributions to the global economy. That's about the most optimistic thing I can say, that climate is going to be back on the agenda. The Biden administration is going to put enormous resources in that area and support for international organizations that can contribute in one way or another to the mitigation of this very dramatic crisis we face in global warming. The WTO is poised to do that, and I think that's good news for U.S. participation and contribution and leadership in that organization. So I've spent a little more than my allotted time, but I hope I put some issues on the table that can spur our discussion, and I look forward to it with you in the coming time we have available. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your very enlightening opening speech. Now I would like to move on to a Q&A session. Before that, I also appreciated your kind words about Minister Yu Myung-hee for her gracious action as well as efforts on the part of Korean government. Now we have an excellent group of commentators today. That says something about your reputation and great credential here also in Korea. Now, first, I would like to invite Professor An Chung-young, former president of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Are you there, Professor An?
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, sure,
Yes.
yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff.
Good to at least
Yeah.
hear you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you on the Zoom. And I really appreciate your very comprehensive coverage on the trade policy under Biden administration. And also, I am very much relieved for the US to return to multilateralism and all the global issues deviating, substantially from the Trump administration. Okay, I have some questions on the, US is joining the original now TPP. And the first question is that the US going to renegotiate to include investor state the clause, and also the strengthening the intellectual property right, especially on the biologics, and also prohibition of like the forced transfer of technology when US entered the CPTPP. Second question, the President Xi Jinping of China, he mentioned that the November last year at APEC meeting, China is willing to join the CPTPP or later maybe TPP. My question is that US is ready to negotiate with China when China really attempt to join the TPP. And I think this Xi Jinping's statement might be just simple rhetoric to take an upper hand against the United States on the regional leadership, competitive leadership. And perhaps he might be motivated to block the Taiwan's entry to the TPP. So what is your view on this? China's the willingness, allegedly willingness to join the TPP. What is your US position on this? And then the second question, what would be the Korea's strategic move to join the TPP as second batch of entrant, the Korea alone or collectively with the other entrant like the UK and the Philippines and Taiwan, so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, thank you. Because I couldn't put up my PowerPoint slides, you would have seen on the slides some of the answers to your question. But the first one, I think the negotiation for the United States would be easier because the CPTPP countries basically suspended but practically eliminated the investor state dispute settlement and the data exclusivity provisions for biologic patents that were so troublesome for Democrats in the Congress. So those were two major obstacles that are out of the way that partially clear the road for U.S. participation. But of course, that was 4 or 5 years ago, 5 years ago now, when the U.S. signed this TPP, February 2016, and a lot of things have changed. So there, in both economics and politics, and so there will need to be additional rules and obligations added to the deal to, I think, make it the world-class deal that was originally envisaged. And I mentioned some of those areas in my talk. Now, the question on China willing to join. Yeah, there have been numerous statements by President Xi Jinping of his interest in considering accession to the CPTPP. And in some areas, China has made strides towards meeting the standards, the high standards of the agreement in areas like financial services and in other areas. But there are a number of areas where the gap between TPP standards and Chinese practice is still very large with regard to labor policies, with regard to access to data because of the Chinese cybersecurity law. And digital trade gets involved in this. There are a number of other areas where it would take some effort to match China, to get China to meet the standards. And then the question would be, does China want to come start a negotiation to actually dilute the standards? And that is easier to do if the United States is not in the room at the negotiating table than if the United States is party to the agreement. This goes back to what President Obama said years ago, that he wants the United States to be there writing the rules, not the Chinese to write the rules. And so I think this is part of the reason why I think the Biden administration will reconsider its early reluctance to renegotiate the TPP and come forward perhaps at the end of this year or next year. But clearly it's going to focus on the domestic economy before it does any international negotiations. Now, where does that leave Korea? And your very astute question. I think now you want to see Korea as a member of the club to give yourself some leverage in the negotiations with China. And because the cost of entry should be relatively low for Korea. You're engaged in the RCEP with many of the CPTPP countries. You have an investment deal already with Japan, and you have free trade agreements with many of the CPTPP countries. So I think the major concern is what it means for the bilateral market access negotiations between Korea and Japan. And that's where I think the United States needs to stand up and say, listen, there are bigger interests at stake than the commercial frictions that have been dominating Korea-Japan commercial relations in recent years. And we ought to find a way to manage those differences and avoid even the appearance of excessive demands on the part of Japan in setting the terms of Korean accession. With the U.S. negotiating at the same time, that would be much easier to do. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is it's unclear to me when the CPTPP countries actually will formally launch negotiations. 4 of the 11 countries have not yet ratified the agreement. Legally, they can go forward and negotiate with just the 7 ratified members negotiating on behalf of the club. But they have always been hesitant to separate themselves. So I'm unclear whether they would go forward until there's a little more time for Malaysia and others to complete their legal processes. Then the question is, and the important one you raised, Do you do it alone, or do you do it as part of a group? And the rules and procedures that have been set by the CPTPP accommodate both, either way. And I think there's some advantage in having other countries on your side of the table. That certainly with the British clearly intend to do that. I think that linking with the UK and hopefully with the United States would be a good strategy. But that requires some consultations and I think preparations over the coming months on what would be the most effective strategy. That's what I would recommend to the Korean government. It's certainly what I have recommended to the US government.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff and Professor An. We have 3 more speakers waiting now. So
okay. I'll try to be more concise.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next, let me connect to your friend, Dr. Park Tae-ho, former Trade Minister of Korea. Professor Park, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah,
yes,
sure.
hi, Tae-ho.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff, and nice to see you. I think your presentation is excellent. The reason why I was thinking is that you stay home and do not work for PIIE in Washington. You have more time to prepare this nice presentation. But in the interest of time, I will ask you one related to Professor An's question, and then another question about WTO. The first one is this. Actually, in Korea, many people are asking because, you know, President Moon recently said that Korea will seriously considering joining the CPTPP, which is, you know, different position the Korean government used to take. After that, we have a lot of interest. One of the, you know, interesting question is this: Korea should wait for the U.S. to come in and negotiate, or we should join before United States join. You mentioned about our, you know, conflict with the Japan, all kind of things. But anyway, which one will be the less costly? Costly means that, you know, you mean that we have to accept many of the new rules and market access, things like that. This is one of the important questions for Korea. If UK is trying to do something, then why not? Korea should start consulting with existing members before, you know, United States actually come in either into CPTPP or TPP. This is my first question. Second question, remember 2013, I was also running for DG of the WTO. Even at that time, the local, I mean, Geneva community ambassadors are very much, you know, frustrated and disappointed, and even, you know, very critical about the current situation at the time, especially for many developing countries. So in other words, WTO should gain some trust from members first, and then from political kind of leaders of the all members. So my question is this: you know, WTO just elected new DG, and you know, without thinking about technical issues, what this new DG should do to provide more, you know, conducive or you know, the trustworthy kind of environment. In doing so, my question is this: is there, you know, I want to hear your opinion about this idea. WTO need for the successful reform strong political support of head of states of all members. In that context, remember when was that? We have had a summit meeting. MC was held with the summit leaders. So not today or tomorrow, but WTO DG may think about holding a WTO summit meeting to give a political push for the successful reform of WTO. Do you think this is quite interesting idea or not? I will stop here. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thank you, Tae-ho. I think you've raised two good points. Let me address the WTO point first. I think the new Director General has to be proactive, and it's difficult to do that in the traditional WTO negotiations because it's a member-driven organization. But where she can make a difference is in plowing new fields for the WTO, and that is in the area of climate and in the area of countering vaccine nationalism, and with a development focus. And she's highly qualified to do that, given her experience at the World Bank, her experience as finance minister of Nigeria, and her chairmanship of Gavi, the vaccine organization. So that's an area where something concrete and constructive could be done relatively quickly to put the WTO back on the map. And I think those are the issues that would also resonate to the second part of your WTO question. How does she bring that before world leaders? And that, I think, the best or more immediate venue for doing that would be in the G20. And again, I think that type of agenda would not divide the G20 like so many other issues divide the G20. And I think that would give her standing. She knows the turf, so I think that's what I would recommend for her. In terms of the sequencing for Korea, sooner the better. But the unknown is what is the price of entry, largely from Japan. And if early consultations, which I think all countries should undertake, the British are already doing so, to sort of get a feel for, or a scoping exercise, as they say in Geneva, get a feel for what will be required in the negotiations. If that scoping exercise and consultations lead to the conclusion that the price is going to be as expected and reasonable, then go ahead early. Don't wait for the variations of US politics. But I'm hoping that by the end of this year, as in the end of the first year of the Obama administration, that President Biden will see the importance of US re-engaging and strengthening its support for allies in the Asia-Pacific region. And one important way of doing so will be rejoining or renegotiating the TPP.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Dr. Park, for joining us today. And next, I would like to invite Ambassador Ho Gyangwu, the former ambassador to OECD from Korea, and first Vice Minister of Finance and Economy in Korea. I would like to invite Ambassador Ho. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much,
Right.
particularly for Dr. Schott for his very insightful and comprehensive presentation. Let me just walk away a little bit from this WTO reform and CPTPP, and instead ask a question about so-called digital trade issues. As you pointed out, under the Trump administration, the targeted approach against China for a particular company like Huawei or specific product caused a lot of problems for its allied countries, as you said, put us between rock and hard place. But now new administration under the Biden are trying to come up with a more pragmatic and comprehensive, as you mentioned, the strategic approach. And the digital trade, setting up comprehensive rules on digital trade is being discussed by Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Scott Campbell. And now there's a talk that in the upcoming G7 meeting hosted by UK, they might be expanded to include countries like Korea to D10. And there's a speculation that this digital trade might be high on its agenda. But now we all know there's a big conflicts of interest on many of these issues, not only between China and the United States, but even among the many democratic market economies. For example, digital tax has become a big issue between France and the United States. So given this complexity as well as a conflict of interest, my question is that how likely and pragmatic is this idea of setting up the digital trade rules, in what time frame and in what channels? Could it be D10 or could it be, as you mentioned, the CPTPP? And what time frame? That's my question.
Well, you've raised a number of important points about the digital trade negotiations and the complications. As I noted in my introduction, the problems in digital trade are not just between the United States and China and China's restrictive access to and use of data and control of the internet. It's also concerns about privacy that are a major friction between the United States and the European Union, and those concerns are shared in Korea and Japan and elsewhere as well. So that is a difficult area to circumvent, but needs to be addressed if there's going to be an effective and substantive agreement on digital trade. My concern is that the policymakers may sacrifice a lot of substance to get a least common denominator agreement, and that won't move or help the businesses that have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. The digital services tax is also a difficult issue. And it's not just with France. There are 301 investigations against, I don't know, 7 or 8 countries, I think, including the UK. So that is a burden where it's unclear whether the OECD negotiations, which were designed to try to come up with some compromise, can succeed. I think the Biden administration will seek to work on that. I think there will be a more constructive approach with the Europeans to try to see areas of where they can begin to narrow their differences. But it's not easy, and I think it is useful for the G7 to work on it and to bring in all of the countries that have a vital stake in the issue.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much, Mr. Ho, for joining us today.
It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a
kind of expected
the solution.
Right.
But the answer is the solution, I think, is going to be harder to come by than than some of the government officials project.
Okay, Mr. Ho, are you satisfied with that?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay,
It's
thank you very much.
but it's unfortunately, I this is one area where I very much hope that I am proven wrong.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Last but not least, we have Dr. Daniel Shin, who is managing director at MCM Group. Is considered one of the rising stars in business community. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Dr. John. Thanks for rich perspective, Jeff. It is really helpful. Like you said, Dr. Ngozi is now confirmed to lead the WTO with the blessing of the Biden administration, but there's a definitely long way to go for Dr. Ngozi, I suppose. WTO's failure to complete the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations prompted advocates of the trade liberalizers to pursue mega regional trade agreements such as CPTPP or TTIP as an alternative to multilateral deals. For WTO to succeed, responsible stakeholders need to be engaged and working together, but today all seems to be really distracted, even if there's a new leadership. WTO's rules are widely abused or flat out ignored sometimes. Even after the U.S.-China trade deal was announced, the U.S. and China continue to violate WTO obligations on a grand scale. In the meantime, CPTPP already incorporates advanced WTO plus disciplines on a state-owned enterprise, e-commerce, and a host of other cutting-edge issues. So, in my humble opinion, WTO seems to be really lost its momentum. Do you think WTO is really dead? And where does Korea have to stand under the Biden administration sentiment toward the multilateral agreements and the WTO? Thank you.
Well, I think we share a common perspective and that's why my last part of my talk was WTO. It wasn't the primary focus, even though in the past WTO was the first and foremost issue for international trade policy. And I think because of the healthy skepticism that the WTO can produce results, and that even when the dispute settlement problems are resolved, and I think they can be resolved this year, that it's important for the WTO leadership, as I mentioned earlier, for the WTO to get some early wins, and the access to medicines is something where it's necessary to prevent new export restrictions, and to also deal a little more controversially with the issue of compulsory licensing, to ensure that there is adequate production facilities in developing countries and not just in India, so that there is a more regional production and distribution of vaccines. And the major producing countries need to share in that, and that's something that Ngozi, I think, is very knowledgeable about from her tenure at Gavi, and can work to do something concrete and in the short term to deal with the current pandemic, and as importantly, to prepare for future pandemics. But climate change, I think, is going to be the area where she puts the WTO back on the map, and not as the solution for climate change, but as part of what the trade community can do to contribute to climate change. And this will require developing countries to be more proportional contributors to international agreements than they have been in the past. They have a lot at stake. The poorest countries risk losing the most because of the inactivity of the WTO and the weakening of the rule of trade law. And you've seen that the United States and China basically ignoring their WTO obligations and imposing tit-for-tat tariff retaliation. So we need to get back to the point where we are responsible shareholders in a rules-based trading system, that the rules are updated and strengthened to deal with these important new challenges that affect international commerce. And there are because of the crises of the moment, there is opportunities for the WTO to break new ground. That's the way I'd look at it. The WTO isn't dead. It's been adrift for a long time, and it is. And if that continues, it will become increasingly irrelevant to the problems of international governance. So that's where I think it's critical that we stop the drift and start making some constructive progress.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jeff. Well, it's already 10 past 11 in Seoul time. But before you go, I am inclined to raise a quick question for you, although it goes beyond the coverage of your presentation and our discussion today. But for the interest of our audience in Korea, would you make any comment or suggestion or share your sense about the recent announcement made by US ITC on the dispute between LG Chem and SK Innovation. I'm not quite sure how closely you're following up on that issue, but any sense that you may like to share with us on likely steps and the kind of like outcome of this.
Well, I am not an expert on this field, but it is a very important case, and it's very unusual. Two Korean companies basically fighting over intellectual property, and the U.S. is involved because it affects the production and import into the U.S. market by subsidiaries and partners of the two Korean companies. What makes it even more important is because it is in a cutting edge technology that is at the heart of many of the new innovations that the Biden administration hopes to see in the U.S. manufacturing and particularly the automotive sector. And this has both industrial consequences, it has employment consequences, and it has climate consequences. So it is a high priority for the Biden administration, and is one of the reasons why electric vehicle batteries are one of the critical technologies that are undergoing a intensive review, as I mentioned earlier, with a detailed look at supply chains and how we can ensure their resilience. So I think that's the context. I'm not an expert on the legal niceties, and the administrative law judges have made rather clear rulings, but the decisions often can lead to out-of-court settlements that promote both the national interest and those of the shareholders of the respective companies. So I think a lot will be happening in this area in the coming 6 months because of the consequences for U.S. production, but also the broader implications for employment and climate in the coming years. And so you're right to raise it. I think this is something that officials, not only in the USTR, but more importantly in the White House, will be focusing on in the coming weeks.
All right. Thank you very much for your final observation on that. And it's time to close. I'm sure our audience will be joining me in thanking you for your sharing great insight with us today. IGE has a long tradition of having a very productive, high-profile forum, and today is one of those. And I'm saying this with great pride to have you on board today. I very much look forward to seeing you soon, real way rather than just virtually. But till then, please stay safe and healthy. And wish you all the best. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, and my best wishes to all my friends in Seoul, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you again in person before the end of the year, if possible.
Okay, all right, okay, well, okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, our audience also. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.